Do you smell that? It's a smelly smell that smells smelly. It smells like nerd talk. I am a massive fan of Xenoblade Chronicles as a series. I love every game. And at one point or another, every game in this series has been in my top 10 games of all time. Most of them still are. And I want to see this series grow and thrive into the future. And I am a game critic. And I'm a firm believer that game critique is important for two main categories. One, to inform the consumer so that they can make a better, more informed purchasing decision as to whether or not they want to play or buy a certain game. And then a step below that would be, well, hopefully to spur constructive conversation surrounding the game to identify its weak points, its strengths, so that future games in the series can learn from that and create an even better game. And I love Xenoblade, but it is not without faults. And in my opinion, one of the main key aspects that the series can really shore up to take into the future, to take another step forward, go up the tier list for a lot of people, is by taking a good, hard look at the gameplay loop that the series has had for over a decade at this point. Now, I've said this for a while, Xenoblade combat, a lot of the time, and to a lesser extent with 3, by the way, but especially with Xenoblade 1 and 2, and X, mainly 1 and X, but 2 to some extent, and 3 to a little bit of a lesser extent, feels like it's a retrofitted design on the MMO hotkey-based combat. And the idea for that is you have a mouse and keyboard and a whole suite of buttons that do their own thing. You have this idea called a rotation, which is essentially the order you press certain buttons for consistent gameplay, but you have a bunch of other buttons surrounding that to give you options and tools in your kit to tackle whatever situation or mechanic the game throws at you. A lot of the time, these buttons can have a rather short cooldown, but you don't ever really feel like you're doing nothing because you have enough buttons or a couple of buttons on a short enough cooldown to where you're almost always pressing something. That is not the case with Xenoblade, because, well, for a very obvious design reason, it's a console game. There's only so many buttons, and while Final Fantasy XIV did show a lot of people that it is capable, or at least possible, to have an MMO with a lot of buttons work on controller and work effectively at that, Xenoblade has always sided with limiting the number of buttons you can press, and they've had it so you press these buttons in different ways. With 1 and X, for instance, they give you a single hotbar with buttons laid out in a horizontal line, and you would just scroll over left to right to press the button you wanted at that moment in time. With Xenoblade 2, they realized, hey, we can kind of fix this a little bit to be more seamless for controller. So what did they do? They mapped those buttons to buttons on your controller. Let me bust out my Nintendo controller. Yeah, so you would have like X, Y, and B for each art that you could use. And this worked surprisingly well. Not surprisingly, but it worked pretty damn well. And in Xenoblade 3, they gave you access to 6 arts at any one moment in time. So what did they use for those buttons? Up, right, and down on the D-pad. And again, it worked pretty damn well. So while the act of you pressing buttons was pretty satisfying, there was a couple of things surrounding it that can sour the experience for a lot of people. Let's talk about tutorials, and let's work our way up in terms of complexity here. Yes, that is right, prepare for a yap session. So, how does the game teach you how to play, which is one of the most important aspects of any game out there? Well, for Xenoblade, generally not that well. There wasn't much to teach the player with Xenoblade 1 outside of, yeah, go left or right to hit the button you want, kind of job done. And then for the Monado art, just use whichever one's glowing for you at the time. You understand those two basics, and you've kind of got a grasp on most of what Xenoblade 1's combat has to offer. You at least have your main tutorial done. For Xenoblade 2, they drew it out till near the end of the game, slowly drip-feeding you mechanics over the course of the entire game, but never really teaching you this in an effective way. And Xenoblade 3 is the same to a lesser degree, because they front-load a lot of that tutorials in the first few chapters. But with Xenoblade 2 and 3, they default a lot of the times to just basic text boxes to teach the player various components of the combat, and there's a simple matter and reality that we have to talk about. While yes, a text box can give you the information, it's not in an effective or engaging format, and a lot of people will simply bounce off of it, wanting to get into the game. Because in my opinion, a good game tutorial is one that teaches you through the gameplay, and teaches you through experience in an engaging way that makes use of the fact that it's a video game. Sometimes a game may throw a challenge at you that requires the use of one key aspect of your kit, and it is only upon utilizing that piece of equipment and the right spot at the right time that you're able to overcome that in-game challenge and then move on, having that experience build up with that aspect of your gameplay kit. And Xenoblade does this to a degree. Remember the initial fight in Xenoblade 3? At the beginning with DJ, when you first learn how to interlink. That is a moment in the game where they genuinely try to teach you how interlinks work in the game through the gameplay, and they have you fight Mobius in that interlinked form, but what's the issue? Because that sounds like it's exactly what I'm talking about, right? That makes sense. So what's the issue? What issue do I have with it? Well, very simple. You only have access to that one interlink, and you're only pressing, really, like one button every, 10 seconds or so? So the mechanism in which you're engaging in that piece of content is rather lackluster and dull because you're not doing a lot. Sure, you are technically playing as an interlink, but there's nothing really inspired by that gameplay loop. The animations are kind of flashy and cool, but in terms of how much you have to be invested in the game, or even paying attention, not really at all. You can look at a completely separate screen and just keep mashing the same 3 buttons hoping something will go off, and chances are that boss will go down. So the introduction and tutorial for learning this piece of the gameplay loop that will become intrinsic later on is rather lackluster and dull. And then everything surrounding that, the game kind of handholds you through the main menu and the options, guiding each button press in an overly drawn out fashion, and that's just not a good way to teach the player. So the issues that I have with the tutorials in Xenoblade Chronicles as a whole is that they default way too often to either hand-holding experiences that go on for way too long, without an option to disable them, or they default to just basic text boxes way too much, which, for a game as potentially complex as Xenoblade, is rather lackluster and dull, because people want to play the game and they want to get back into the world and not have to read a bunch, especially right when they start the game. But also, most of the time in Xenoblade Chronicles, you're really only learning how to press a button. You're not learning how to use that button. Now, what do I mean by that? And that's when we need to come up upon a particular system. I don't know if these terms have actual terms used in the industry. Just off the top of my head, I thought of internal versus external mechanics. Internal mechanics being the buttons that you press, the tools in your kit. Like being able to interlink in Xenoblade 3, or Rex with Mithra being able to heal based on critical hits. Rolling smash, double spinning edge, your arts, those kinds of stuff, yeah? Monado arts from Xenoblade 1, overdrive from Xenoblade X, stuff like that, internal mechanics, stuff that comes from you and your characters and your party, versus external mechanics, which is what the enemies do to you, what the bosses do to you, what you have to pay attention to, look out for, and react or prepare for. Because in my opinion, this is where a lot of enemy design in Xenoblade kind of falls to the wayside. There's simply not enough external mechanics to really balance out this interplay for MMO kind of gameplay that Xenoblade is trying to instill upon the player. It's not like Xenoblade doesn't have external mechanics at some point or the other. In Xenoblade 1, you had to utilize Monado arts to counteract what the enemy was doing, which is a cool concept. But again, Xenoblade has a tendency to oversimplify gameplay aspects, in my opinion, that don't need to be overly simplified. Because there's no real thought process behind utilizing Monado arts. It's the game slows down for a bit, essentially tells you that the game is going to do something to you. You swap over to Shulk or you run up to him, have him do a Monado art that is glowing on the hotbar for you, and then you stop thinking about it. So instead of augmenting your gameplay in interesting ways, or finding the right tool for the job, all those different Monado art attacks just kind of feel very similar to one another, in that they counteract whatever the game is throwing at you one way or the other, and there's no real thought process. You just hit whatever's shining for you. Now, some people will find that enjoyable, and I don't feel that Xenoblade as a series would suffer from having an easy mode, which it already has, and stuff like that, for people who genuinely just want gameplay loops like that. And that's entirely fine. Not saying one way or style is better than the other, I can just only tell you what I personally feel, and what I feel will benefit the game in the long run, in terms of popularity. And here is where we come across one of my biggest issues when it comes to enemy design in Xenoblade Chronicles. Because for Xenoblade 1, the only boss mechanic that I can really remember is when Gato shoots his sniper rifle at you if you're not behind cover when you're trying to approach him in Mechonis. And that for Egio, you have to destroy the reactor thing, and then use Monado Watts every now and then. And that Mechonis, or Mechon enemies, require Monadowat or your party members to have anti-Mechon weaponry equipped. That is it. For the entire game, it's really just those three things that I remember. Nothing else left a lasting memory for me. When we come to Xenoblade 3, I only remember that there was one unique Rhino mob in the 3rd zone that could charge you. That is the only mechanic outside of M's mind control, which I just always ignored, which you can kind of do, by the way, that I remember in all of Xenoblade 3. There's not a single other boss mechanic that I remember or recall or have any experience or memory with. I could not tell you what Zed does as a final boss. I couldn't tell you. All I know is that he becomes Dormammu from Doctor Strange. That is fine for some people, but for me, that significantly undercuts what the combat loop could be. It also undercuts the amount of viable builds, because all these cool pieces of equipment or arts that you have at your disposal that could be utilized to counteract certain playstyles that are thrown at you are just not useful, because nothing that the bosses or the enemies do calls for that. So you just boil down to what does more damage and what heals me the most. I think where this series really shined in this regard was back in Xenoblade 2, but specifically on a difficulty mode called Bringer of Chaos. In Bringer of Chaos, you had to pay attention. If you were level appropriate, you had to pay attention to what the bosses did. They may throw down a rocket that you have to DPS down, or it's going to explode into a giant AoE that can wipe the party. Malos is my standout fight in Xenoblade 2 on Bringer of Chaos. Why is that? Because you can build to counteract him. A lot of his attacks do dark damage, and some of them, if you're level appropriate by the way, can just simply one-shot you or do like 90% of your health. You can stack up and suffer a bit of a DPS loss, but you can stack up dark damage reduction on you and your party so that those attacks become more manageable. He has an ability called Monado Ida, which is a projectile that he throws at a member of your party that blows up into an AoE. So generally speaking, throughout the fight, knowing that he can do that, you spread your party out, so that no one, or at least you, aren't standing too close to anyone else, so if they get hit with Monado Ida, you don't necessarily take that damage or suffer the negative consequences. Monado Buster, just don't stand in front of him, duh. Monado Cyclone, giant AoE around him as a character, so if he's about to do it, or you fear that he's about to do it, like he hasn't done it in a little bit, you back up a little bit, get out of his danger zone, wait for him to cast it, then go back in. It's not much, it really isn't, but it's something to keep in mind. You can build around him as a fight. You can also put on, I forget the name of the exact stat, but it's like blade lockdown reduction, so that when he tries to lock down blades or drivers, you can have resistance to that and not be affected by that, which can be extremely damaging and rough to deal with if you don't build around it. And I think Bringer of Chaos for Xenoblade 2 best makes use of the RPG mechanics that Xenoblade 2 and Xenoblade as a series has at its disposal. It makes you think on a fight-per-fight basis, how can I best counteract what the game is throwing at me? Because the game genuinely does throw things at you that you have to pay attention to. That fight on the cliffs of Morthab against Malos and Jin, if you are level appropriate, can be a massive pain in the ass, because you have to deal with all those Malos mechanics, but also what Jin can do. And Jin can pump out a lot of damage, can get you animation locked. He can do a lot to you that you have to toy around with alongside Malos fighting you. Sometimes the bosses will taunt you to one of them, so you have to pay attention to who you're doing damage to. Maybe you focus down the guy that can taunt, so that the taunt is off the table and you don't have to deal with him as a fight as you deal with everyone else. That's a viable strategy. Or you can try and do as much damage as you can to someone weaker so that when you get taunted, you can use AoE attacks and kill them like that. There's ways and methodologies to think about how to interact and take down each of these boss encounters, and to me that makes them more memorable, more engaging, and simply more fun. It's one of the reasons I love Xenoblade 2 so much, because that's all on the table for Bringer of Chaos, but if you play on normal mode or custom difficulty, you can focus way more on your internal mechanics if you're just feeling like that, because sometimes that's how we feel. Sometimes it's a lot of fun to just spam out chain attacks and go for big bursty damage with all of the elemental orbs blowing up on an enemy, going for full burst with Cosmos and just saying GG, well played. Sometimes that is fun, and the game gives you the option on a moment's notice to vary up your playstyle and what the game is going to throw at you. But especially on Bringer of Chaos mode, I feel that the balance between internal mechanics and external mechanics is in a far better position than the other Xenoblade games. Now, I've said before that Xenoblade X is my favorite gameplay-wise for all of Xenoblade. I love X a lot. I'm a bit of an X fanboy, if you will. So why do I say this? Because I don't think it does external mechanics as well as Xenoblade 2 Bringer of Chaos. Well, I think the pacing for the internal mechanics is really fun, and there's ways to augment your playstyle so that you are pressing buttons at a relatively decent clip. And there's a lot of customization and augmentation of your playstyle in Xenoblade X that I really enjoy, to coincide with the skill mechanics. But also, most fights in the game, even regular mobs, have ways for you to tackle them in different ways. You may want a piece of loot that is only found by breaking off a specific limb that you can target on the enemy. Or you're doing a boss fight, and I distinctly remember this. For Xenoblade X, there's a fight against a giant floating fortress at some point throughout the main campaign, and each of its limbs do different mechanics, but you can target them, and if you manage to target them correctly, you can take out that weapon system, so it's just a non-factor for the rest of the fight. You can prioritize and augment the boss to what you deem is the biggest threat and go from there. And that works for regular enemies as well sometimes, and I love that idea and that design. It makes each fight feel more natural. It makes me feel like I'm not just fighting a giant sack of health. I am fighting something composed of different ideas and mechanisms that I can disable. But we also come across another aspect of gameplay that is often not talked about enough for Xenoblade, because I don't think gameplay and having interesting gameplay boils down to just combat. These games are open world, or at least open zone, and the mechanisms surrounding you interacting with the world can often be kind of one-dimensional. It's another reason why I love Xenoblade X so much, because there's multiple ways to augment your experience with that open world. Whether or not you're in a skill changes your perspective and the scale upon the world, which incentivizes you to re-explore various areas or discover things that you didn't find before. So it has this great sense of exploration surrounding it, and when you get flying, oh man, dude, it feels so good. Then for the other Xenoblade games, a lot of it just kind of boils down to you going from point A to point B. And there's various things that you can collect, but for a lot of the games, there's no real way to genuinely interact with the open world in an engaging way. Xenoblade 2 being one of the biggest offenders of this, because the way they try and subvert that is through the skill points, which is one of the most universally hated idea in Xenoblade 2, because you have to completely change out your entire party just so that you can burn some vines or something. And you don't feel like you are the one burning your vines, you just felt like you hit a skill check, and then you see a really short and uninspired animation most of the time, and you go from there. It's not in a fun or rewarding way. Whereas, in my opinion, I feel like if you come across a giant thing of ice or vines, and then you could play as Pyra and just use your fire sword to do an attack or two, and cause it to ignite in flames and then disappear, it's not much, but it's a little bit more mechanical feedback and agency on the player's perspective and part than just trying to meet some obscure arbitrary number. Like, imagine for leaping, imagine at that point you could hold the button down and aim that jump yourself. Again, it's not much, but it's putting more agency and mechanical feedback in the player's hands, which I feel, and you don't have to have it so you can leap everywhere in the overworld. You could if you wanted to. You don't have to, but it's just some way to add a mechanical, responsive feeling to navigating the world in the player's hands, instead of forcing you to take a bit of a backseat approach to it. Xenoblade 3 kind of does a little bit of what I'm talking about here. With grinding rails, you have to jump onto the rail, and then you can choose when to jump off of the rail. That's cool, right? I love that mechanic, I love that idea. But I don't think they lean far enough into that philosophy as they should, and that's something I would really like to see them double down on going into the future Xenoblade games. I think Xenoblade 3 in a lot of ways takes steps in the right direction, just not big enough. In Xenoblade X, one of the taglines and one of the ways they advertised that game was that if you could see it, you could go there. Some way, somehow, you can either run up there, jump up there, or fly to there. If you saw it, you could get to it. And to me, I found it fun trying to find ways to glitch the pathing or find a way to Skyrim horse jump my way up mountains and hillsides to get to places I couldn't have access to before. That was super fun to me, and then you unlock flying, and flying itself is really fun. You feel the speed, you feel the grandeur of it all. You have a song that was designed just to play when you're flying. It's great. I want more things like that. I want to feel like that again in Xenoblade. Because I don't think these open worlds have to just be you walking from point A to point B, fight a mob or something, or collect a node that is just there that you walk by for a side quest. GG, well played. The game can be more than that, in my opinion. And I think it can also help bolster the story, because Xenoblade Chronicles is not an anime. It is not a movie, it is not a TV show, it is a video game. And in my opinion, one of the best ways to tell a video game story is to utilize video game mechanics and unique aspects of the medium to your advantage to further that story. In my opinion, one of the most brilliant story sections in all of Xenoblade is Chapter 5 of Xenoblade Chronicles 3, the Eclipse section. It is immaculate, I love that section, it tells an incredible narrative that throws the entire story on its head. I love it so much. I have one major issue with it. It is all cutscene. And the only gameplay, which I do like, is having Noah walk through this world of white fog, trying to find his memories that, who would soon to be revealed as Mio, is trying to guide him to. That is cool. We needed more, because it's not making use of the aspects and ideas of being a video game to its fullest advantage. I don't mind a long cutscene. I don't. But I think genuinely, in moments like this, having some gameplay that is interesting and fun and dynamic would go a long way to further make these scenes even more memorable than they already are. Not saying that they aren't memorable, they really are. Like I said before, this is one of my favorite sections in the entire series, but I think they can be even more than that. Imagine we had sections where we played as Noah or N back then in those flashbacks, fighting Zed off multiple times, and eventually, each and every time, we get overwhelmed, and we feel like we're getting overwhelmed in the gameplay as he does more and more attacks. Or we get overwhelmed by various Mobius forces or whatever, time and time again, and we struggle and we claw even through the gameplay, but time and time again, Zed comes out on top. We watch Mio die, and a cycle repeats all over again. And then imagine there was a section where after Mio turns to Nesquik powder, Noah takes Gondor through the woods in a section that's kind of like an escort quest where we desperately fend off Mobius forces or forces of Kevas and Agnes, trying to safeguard Gondor, get him to a point where he can be by himself and be safe, because we know we're on the clock, and throughout that entire section, we feel ourselves getting weaker and weaker and weaker. Think the end of Crisis Core, right? From Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. Over this series of little mini-fights, Noah goes from just absolutely one-shotting everybody to it being a struggle to even take down a small group of mobs, to even being a struggle to take down one. And then it culminates in that one scene where he's finally safe. He can allow himself to die, knowing Gondor will be at least as safe as he can make him be in that present moment. That's just off the top of my head, but you understand what I'm talking about, right? Because funnily enough, Xenoblade 3 tries to do this earlier on when you fight M, with her mind control abilities, and you have to fight various members of your party. The problem is that the overlying structure of combat in Xenoblade 3 kind of subverts that fight, because what can you just do? You can just focus in on M either way. There's not much thought process behind who gets mind controlled. You just DPS them down if you need to, and then just go back to DPSing down Mio, or M. But I see what they were trying to do there. That is telling the story through the gameplay, and we are feeling the effects ourselves of our party members getting mind controlled. That's a cool concept that wasn't executed upon the best, but it's a cool concept nonetheless that I hope gets expanded on in the future. I even have a similar problem when it comes to Future Redeemed. Remember the very end of it, where everyone interlinks into that one giant JoJo stand to take on Alpha? Why wasn't that a gameplay section? Like, why couldn't we control that guy for even a small little fight and just clap up Alpha? How cool would that have been, right? Just like being able to play as that giant Giga Chad beast guy. That would have been sick. And it's moments like that that I really hope get shored up and expanded on, fleshed out, and shown to us, and let us play through these sections ourselves instead of just showing us. And I hope that happens in the future with Xenoblade Chronicles, because I feel that if they're able to have better enemy design, slightly change up the combat, because I do like the gameplay loop of Xenoblade games, I really do. But every now and then you have these periods of downtime where you're just not really doing anything, and they need to shore that up a bit. And there's a lot of other aspects to the combat loop of Xenoblade we can talk about. And I've said before, one of the reasons I love the Xenoblade 2 internal gameplay loop is I love the synergy between out of chain attack combat and in chain attack combat, where outside of the chain attack, you are building up elemental orbs on the enemy that when you go into a chain attack, you can then pop and do a lot of damage and work around what you built up beforehand. And when you are building those up, they give you different bonuses and effects that you can make use of, like doing limiting reinforcements for the Elma fight to prevent her from bringing in her backup. Stuff like that. I love stuff like that. That synergy was so fun to me. And while I love the Xenoblade 3 combat loop overall, and the chain attack, there wasn't that synergy between out-of-chain attack combat and in-chain attack combat to the same degree and fashion that Xenoblade 2 had it. Arguably, I like Overdrive from Xenoblade X the most, because it utilized the arts you already had, but at a far faster clip, and I loved that feeling of adrenaline as you're frantically pushing all of your buttons, trying to extend your overdrive limit, and do so much more damage. It's super fun and satisfying and rewarding to me. I love that. That increased pace and ferocity really made me feel like I was going into overdrive. It was so much fun. The point being, I love Xenoblade. I love it so much, but I think it can be even better, and I want to see it be better. Not to rest on its laurels, right? Because when you play Xenoblade as much as I have, and you play all the titles, and you go in order, you can feel that sense of progression as they try and mix the experience up and try new things, try and better the old ideas of the past from each iteration and from each game to the next. They try that so much, and you can tell there's a genuine, honest effort to make the best game that they can. And in my opinion, I think taking to heart some of the ideas of what I've said and laid out in this video could go a long way to making the series even more popular, fun, engaging, and to tell an even better story by interweaving the storytelling with the gameplay sections. I love Xenoblade. I can't wait to see what they've got cooking up. So here's where you come in and what I want you to do. Let me know in the comments down below what one singular change you would do to the gameplay formula from Xenoblade, or what's your favorite mechanic from all of Xenoblade. Do you like the chain attack of 3, of 2, or overdrive of X? Do you love Monado arts? Do you love Numa from Xenoblade 2 as a gameplay mechanic? I do as well. Do you love character swapping from Xenoblade 3? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions. Let me know your own critiques, how you think this series can be even better or more fun in the future. I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your perspectives and hear your opinions. So stay safe, leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. So stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games if you can, and as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye bye everybody, until we meet again.